So we are getting started with the next session in just a minute. If you would uh, get settled. So as an introduction, I think a lot of things that we are discussing today are kind of back to the basics type of discussion, like we discussed lab values earlier session. The next one is really talking about safety, addressing the gaps in neonatal safety reporting. For the purposes of advancing drug development in this population. For this session, I'm honored to welcome a long-term colleague, Carol Allegaert, who is from Leuven and Erasmus University Medical Center in Belgium. He's going to be leading this session as a moderator. The panelists are Jerry Baer from FDA, Dr. Hide Nakamura from NCCHD Japan, Dr. Amin Maltip from UCSF. I believe do you know if Ralph Bax is already here? Yeah, Dr. Ralph Bax from EMA, he's on remotely. Victoria Nicholas from Oak Hill Bio and Anup Challa from AstraZeneca. So Carol, this is all yours.
Thank you for your kind introduction. This session is all about safety assessment. And a little bit similar to the lab value, safety in neonates is obviously an issue. During the coffee break, we were discussing on the first Inc. event, which was 10 years ago in London. And the funny thing is that at that time, we had to defend different clinical scenarios for uptake within the Inc. For those who were there, they may still recall it. And actually, lab values and neonatal safety were not even considered at that time. So it also shows that being 10 years further down the line, that we have learned somehow what were needed and how to adapt our strategies. So this session is on addressing gaps in neonatal safety, further building on the neonatal adverse severity score, which has also been developed within this group. It remains a major obstacle. And so the intention is to explore further these challenges and obviously how this group may further contribute to next steps. And obviously adverse event and adverse of expected outcome, a little bit like the lab values remains a complex thing. I have a distinct and diverse panelists with me, also a lot of people that I happen to learn to know thanks to the CPAT and Inc. initiative. And some of them have a more regulatory background, like Gary and Ralph, while others have more an academic type of background or an industry-related background. And perhaps it's good to start with FDA and Gary, because you're the lead in decisions. And so I think the first question, it's also something that I personally struggled with, is the difference between seriousness and severity. That sounds an easy task, and actually also to assess seriousness in newborn is also demanding. So I would like to reflect on how this affects FDA or any other agency to assess safety data.
Thank you, Carl.
Sure.
Good to see everyone. As a regulator, our work is in the interpretation of the data. So we're receiving your safety reports and your clinical trial data, and our work is to interpret. I can talk more narrowly about safety versus, serious versus severe, or, that's actually for me, it's a fairly straightforward question. So, the severity is what you built the NAESS to really address in the neonatal population with neonate specific problems, which were not, in existence in the CTCAE and, in the adult severity scale. So it was a brilliant, project, and I'm continuing to enjoy watching it being refined. And certainly when we get neonatal trial data into the agency, hoping that it will be utilized. So severity is the grading scale, and then seriousness is the impact. So is there You know, we need to know if a patient died, had a life-threatening complication, had required, you know, prolonged hospitalization. This is one of the nuances. You know, in the adult world, if somebody gets hospitalized, it's severe. But for our neonates, they're already hospitalized often. So it's prolongation of hospitalization, you know, permanent or you know long-term sort of disability issues that and the other category in serious is congenital anomaly, which doesn't really apply to our neonates. So you know the seriousness you know determines the reporting to the FDA. The serious and unexpected adverse drug reactions need to be rapidly reported to the FDA, and then the severity is your standardized grading. But I can stop there and let others talk, and then I can give a more broad overview if you want of
Yeah,
what we.
but you said we assess data, and so how would the system be improved to facilitate your assessment of IE events when you get your papers on your desks?
Right. So I think one of the most important key pieces at the very outset is to define and clearly tell us what is the primary endpoint, what is the intent of your product and your program. And then the other endpoints are also very important, but they're often going to capture, you know, is this, you know, are we trading off one problem for another? Is this safe? Are we reducing the rate of disease X while not increasing the rate of disease Y? So, you know, once you've defined your clear, what are you trying to do with your product? Then we need clear definitions of the condition and the other sort of, you know, comorbidities. They have to be well defined. And then, you know, one of the really important pieces which ties back to the last, you know, to the data discussion is, you know, we really need baseline data to understand whether the rate of a given condition, you know, if you're looking at these data in the aggregate, you know, is the placebo group having a higher rate of, or is the treatment group having a higher rate of a given adverse event than the placebo group? And is that within the expected range or is it outside the expected range of that adverse event? And then once you have looked at your aggregate, once we've looked at our aggregate data, you know, these aren't large studies. So, and even in some of the non-neonatal work that I do now, we're looking at individual case review. And so you need expertise, you need good expertise on your DSMBs, you need people who can, you know, take a high level view and also an unbiased view and really sort out whether this could be drug related. And I'll just stop there so others can pipe up.
Thank you for your comments. Now I will listen to the voice in the sky. Ralph, are you there?
Yes, I'm here, and thank you for letting me participate. Unfortunately, I couldn't travel due to administrative reasons, but you know, I miss you all seeing you in person. Hi.
It's reciprocal. So thank you for your presence now. Obviously, a lot of clinical trials, especially newborns, are global in their design, or at least intended to have impact in different regions of the world. So my first question for you would be, how do you see alignment between EMA and FDA and other agencies related to IE severity grading and its assessment, and to what extent these tools like the NIS are supportive of that?
I mean, as Jerry just said, I mean, it's primarily important that the signs and symptoms are interpreted consistently and lead to the same diagnosis regardless of region in the end. I believe also looking self-critically at the European network, for sure, there needs to be an enhancement in expertise, specifically also in this area. I can just also comment that it sometimes really goes down to case reports. But on the other hand, we believe that such a tool could be a sort of foundation and provide a common framework to do all of this. And specifically now, if we also, you know, broaden our regulatory work, day-to-day work, to also include more other agencies and to benefit from their expertise. I'm here looking a little bit at Japan. Indeed, it would be helpful if we would have such a basic tool, but in the end, we would still have to look potentially into clinical data, specifically if it is only a couple of patients to be looked at. But it I'm convinced it would help us to move towards greater consistency. Thank you.
Thank you for an answer. I can only say that they are nodding over here, so there seems to be an agreement with what you have said, if you cannot see us. And then perhaps a somewhat impolite question, but between Europeans we can be impolite. But what could Europe do, or what could EMA do to improve the current neonatal safety reporting? How do you look at from an agency type of perspective?
I mean, I could ask back, what exactly do we want to improve? Is it consistency? Is it number of reports? Is it so? I think we need to be clear about that, and then we could also look into situations how reporting has been done, but that would mean additional research work with a clear question to see how it actually is, in order to avoid just some hypotheses. But again, it boils down to discussion early on, discussion of every individual development project early on, and then we could also tackle this from the outset. For example, push for it in IPSPs or PIPs. But that can only be done if we discuss early on, and for that we need to be also informed early on by developers of what is happening in their space.
Yeah. Just as an add-on, the way we have tried to explore the add-on value of the NIS actually was indeed related to consistency and the inter-individual variability in the assessment, which was improved both in a retrospective as well as a prospective design. To my mind, at that time, this was the major observation, because I'm not sure how authorities look at it, but you're drowning IEs in the neonatal population, so it's not a number. We should not increase further the number, but the meaning and the consistent reporting. When I have to talk to colleagues on that, I try to explain it, and perhaps it's a tricky explanation in the current global resistance against vaccinations. But if you would report apnea after vaccination and preterms, doesn't matter only how many events you had between both groups, but also the severity, because you imagine that one strategy would be less severe. You may actually be informed on how you would like to use a vaccine in this given population. So that's the harmonization, I think, is an important contributor. Thank you for your contributions. Please continue to listen and jump in later onwards. We'll shift to another continent following Europe, and then technically it will be Japan, right? Hide, yeah. Well, I don't think so. If you consider this to Belgium, it's a huge country. So Hide, based on your clinical experience and in the Japanese context, I assume, how are neonatal outcomes versus IE typically distinguished in clinical research or in clinical trials? And could it be that cultural, social, whatever you know it, could be impacting these assessments?
Sorry, I'm looking at the iPhone because Isamu Hokuto is in Japan trying to contact me whenever he has a comment. And he's a guy, Isamu Hokuto is a guy, Japanese neonatologist mainly involved in evaluation of NES and also validation, like a Japanese translation of validation. And as he's actually evaluating whether it's valid, it's used in one of the investigator-initiated clinical trials. And for now, he doesn't see any cultural issue or any complaints about scores.
Yeah.
But what he wanted to point out was that many physicians don't understand the difference between side effects and adverse events. And in clinical trials, we have to pick up any adverse event, and then we accumulate the data and then evaluate whether it's really a side effect or not. So and he pointed out that that's a major issue in Japan. And if we continue to evaluate and do evaluation in multiple centers, maybe we have to make a good educational tool to educate neonatologists. Well, it's not only neonatologists. It's
Mhm.
like
The
very
whole ecosystem.
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
That's yeah, I recognize that. I assume it's not specific for Japan at all, but it is for any clinical trial anywhere in the world that people bedside struggle with the concept of an adverse event because they say, yeah, but it always happens to a baby. But that's not the argument in a clinical trial. It's an event, and then you can subsequently assess its causality and severity and whatever. And if you would like to go to global harmonization, are there any things that you could add on that?
Now Inc. is going toward NEST 2.0, right? More on different symptoms, and that's really
correct. Yeah.
appropriate. And some people question about the validation, but even the CTCAE, not all the scores are really validated.
Yeah.
So we will try. At least we have a score, and then we can do standardization. And I think we're going to the right direction. And my colleagues in Japan would be happy to contribute to the evaluation.
So if I understood your comment well, it's even more important to make it broader and then obviously harmonize
Yep.
globally, but we need more adverse event type of things
Exactly.
beyond the generic assessment.
Yeah.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more on that. And we are, Inc. is working on that, as you obviously know. Then we are back to the US. With the question for you, I assume that you have experience with academic-initiated trials versus commercial trials. Is there any difference? Should there be any difference? Could you reflect a little bit on that?
Yeah, thanks for the question. I'm actually a bit of a budding clinical trialist, so I haven't actually run any trials myself. I'm coming really from the background of developmental biology and academia and trying to advance the landscape of therapeutics for neonatology. And so maybe I can shift a little bit and I'll let the more seasoned experts in the clinical trial space speak. But my biggest challenge in reading the literature and trying to plan clinical trials is to distinguish between primary outcomes and adverse events, especially in the preterm infant population, right? Because as a basic biologist who's done a lot of work trying to understand the fundamental pathophysiology driving the outcome or the adverse event, there's a tremendous amount of overlap. So I think the fundamental mechanisms driving ROP, and we have one of the world's experts on ROP here with us today, and BPD are quite similar, but they can be either a primary outcome or an adverse event. And I find it very challenging to kind of really go into great detail with respect to severity of individual adverse events without lumping them together. And the question I would ask this audience is, how much utility would there be for a sort of a composite outcome score, as opposed to going towards primary outcomes like BPD? And I see people grimacing already. I know this is contentious, but there's so much overlap between ROP, BPD, PVL, and NEC, for example, from fundamental mechanistic drivers. I find it very challenging as somebody with a background in basic science and developmental biology to really distinguish the two. And I think therapies that are going to help one are probably going to help the others. And those that hurt one are probably going to be seen in the other disease areas as well. So this is a contentious area. I just want to throw it out just to be a little bit contrarian potentially. But what about the role of composite outcome score? So that's what I would.
Well, although timing may also be relevant, obviously the biology should not be always in the different organs, exactly the same thing.
For sure. Yeah. The ROP emerges at a particular time frame we know versus, BPD and PVL.
I see in a non-verbal communication that I better open up the
John might have something to say about
discussion to the public.
No, never. I've been hanging out with Lynn for a while. We always have an opinion. I think that's an excellent point. And, we're all nodding the same way. So many of these outcomes are integrated among them. And that's what makes it so challenging. For so long, we always had combined outcomes because if you died early, then you couldn't develop BPD. But if you dropped all those kids out, then you're biasing your sample. So, when we wrote our BPD paper for Inc., we said, really looking at those early deaths is important because understanding and enrolling those kids in clinical trials may help them keep them alive. Yeah, they may develop BPD, but they'll be alive to do it. I've seen more people now starting to get sort of a conglomerate, bad outcome kind of thing, with kids having different kinds of complications. And to me, it really builds on what Hide said. Babies get apnea prematurity. We see it in every premature baby. Is that an adverse event? Most clinicians will say, okay, well, he had 2 apneas today, 1 yesterday. Does that mean that's an adverse event? Right. You've had a huge increase. So, of course, we can't say to Jerry, okay, well, now we're reporting every single time there's an increased apnea. And how do they put that in any kind of context? They can't. So I agree with what you're saying. I'm just not sure how to set it up, and that would be interesting. Jerry, I'm sure you have thoughts about that.
Right, I think it's a great idea. I think, I know there's at least one academic group that's been working on it, and unfortunately, I don't know where they are with that, with this sort of composite or a ranking scale. I think at this point in time, it would be an amazing exploratory, kind of a secondary endpoint to see how something like that would operate. And it might be more useful for safety even than efficacy. But it's certainly worth looking at.
It's thought, well, it further refers to your initial comment that you say, well, efficacy versus no additional comorbidities created. So it's all about the same balance. We want to make things better, but not at the cost of other things. So that's
We used to have death or for a lot of, and for better or worse, I mean, well, for better, really, we don't have a lot of deaths anymore. That's a good thing. I mean, other than, our extreme preterm babies, survival is excellent. And so, clearly, like John said, we still need to incorporate those babies that died early. I think BPD is a good example because you have a pretty good sense for which babies died because their lungs don't work. And those are some of the earlier deaths, and that could be included in, in a pulmonary endpoint. But yeah, certainly worth exploring, and thanks for bringing it up.
The follow-up I'd like to ask is really kind of from a biz dev as a drug manufacturer standpoint. Would going after a composite outcome increase the addressable market and therefore increase the appeal of going into a particular space like neonatology, which they tend to shy away from? Which is the other thought, because it's a small pie at the end of the day, relatively speaking. And if we continue to divvy it up and say we're only going to go after ROP, which has, a pretty small market share, that's going to not be very attractive to a manufacturer. Whereas if we said there's a composite outcome of a healthy preemie, whatever you want to call it, that opens it up to the entire potentially $29 billion that we heard earlier today. So that might be a way to help advance the, drug development in this space altogether.
This sounds like a very useful approach. The only thing that I would like to add, if we come with this type of compound outcomes, it likely should be supported by parents and that they are indeed of sufficient clinical, of patient relevant outcome in its impact. Yes, please.
So the concept of a composite outcome is obviously very attractive from a drug development standpoint.
But
okay, the question, of course, is to the regulators, which of and you'd have to, I guess, prioritize which of the diseases is the most relevant, because there are different divisions within each of the regulatory agencies that might be the lead agency that's going to review the package. Or is there is there an alternative way of approaching this?
Gary,
Because each
you
one
have
of
the-
them is, BPD obviously ranks really high up in terms of mobility, but RRP in and of itself is an NEC, all these things all play roles in ultimately whether you have a baby is going to be healthy or not. So how does a drug developer go ahead with it?
I was going to see if Ralph wants to take this. I'm happy to, but I think we should probably, I don't want to go too far askew from Ralph. Did you have a comment, or sorry to throw you under the bus? I think it's a tough question. I think you have to go with your primary biology and what you're expecting your product to do. And your preliminary data. I think you need to go with that first.
Yeah.
And I'll just stop
I
there.
think in respect of time and respect also for the relevant contributions of those who have to develop the drugs, I would like to shift indeed to industry and perhaps ask you first, and how do you perceive this lack of standardization and the progresses, and perhaps also your personal experience with the score in a clinical trial? Could you reflect on that?
Yeah, thanks, Carol, for the question. So clearly, standardization is the aim. And if you direct your questions to the clinical study site, they're fantastic at identifying things that are wrong with the baby. But those has to be translated into adverse events, and severity scoring they're very good at because that's what they do on a daily basis. The seriousness assessments are something that takes a little bit more. And the additional classification, in addition to what Jerry mentioned, is the important medical event is also a part of seriousness. And then the other challenge is, was it due to the therapeutic or not? And sort of setting yourself up as a physician, if that's the only thing that's different, the tendency is to want to say this was related. But you have to back away and say, what are the things that rule relatedness out, which is a little different and difficult. But all of these things taken together from our perspective, leading a global clinical study in several areas of the world, we needed to have a standardized way of choosing adverse events to begin with. And so we leveraged the neonatal adverse event severity scoring and put it into a web app, which we called Neonatal Adverse Event Tool, so that every investigator at their desk, at their bedside, could access the various adverse events that were selected by the INC, and then the severity grading that goes with the unique terms, and then the generic severity grading that might go with those that they observe. So every sign, symptom, and disease is a potential adverse event, but it's also medical history. And so it's important and incumbent, I think, upon the sponsor to say, when do you start recording adverse events as compared to medical history? The medical history of an extremely premature infant is basically the mother, and then it has to stop at a certain time. When you start infusing or randomize that subject, then they become adverse events. So you have to set up the boundaries to standardize the way investigators are looking at this. So creating the tool was one thing that allowed us to get everybody on the same page. And we actually have a Japanese translation we're about to roll out, because that's also essential. And the translation of those terms and the translation of things even like SUSAR from, English to Japanese is important, because you can make little mistakes that change the definition. So standardization, ease of use, and application was really critical. And I think that setting this up as a easily accessible versus using the PDF, which is still electronic, but it's just clunky. Now, the other thing that Jerry alluded to, and what's important here, is when something is reported as a serious adverse event, there's a long narrative or a narrative that goes along with that, because somebody somewhere is reading, do we believe this is related when we generate our benefit risk profile? And so if you look at many of the adult trials, those narratives can be bullets, very, very short. And the guidance from the industry, or from the agencies, hasn't been recently updated, but it is, you have to include enough so that sitting in a room, I'm convinced this is what happened, and it is either attributed to or independent of the IME. So we've had challenges with our study sites in terms of giving us enough information related to what happened, what medications, what interventions led to the serious adverse event. But really, so that's an additional level of education that the tool helps, because it says, if you encounter this, think about including these points in your narrative. But I can't force your hand or your pen on it. You have to do it. I think we're fortunate that neonatologists are great storytellers. They really are. But it's really shaping that story so it makes sense for what we need to capture. So I applaud the activity of INC in developing the first 1.0, and I applaud the additional efforts to add adverse events to that tool, which may be important in terms of our clinical trials. The final thing I will just say is that the other challenge we had is, how do you separate, and Jerry mentioned, others have alluded, the adverse event from the efficacy endpoint. And I had initially in our creation, getting centers ready for the study, they said, well, why do I have to collect, BPD as an adverse event? Isn't that your primary efficacy endpoint? And we said, well, yes, you need to, because you don't know if you're making this disease more severe or increasing the incidence of. Now, how does a study center in an open label study look at all of these things? They may be more inclined to report in the intervention arm because that's your tendency. You're nervous, you're concerned, but they have to take that away and look at every arm the same. So BPD severity, when it is an efficacy endpoint and it's an important safety measure, what you need then to do is to introduce ways in which you blind the overall team to those adverse events that overlap with efficacy endpoints. So you're never looking at the intervention arm versus the therapeutic arm. So you blind them and let the DSMB adjudicate safety signals, because that's the other important aspect. But standardization, robust processes, and then hoping that the agency moves forward with our composite endpoints really going to drive a better outcome. And, we presently have in our exploratory endpoints a composite based on the strong academic work that's out there. And I think there was even a recent publication looking at longer term outcomes based on those composite outcomes. So I'll stop there.
No, it's really interesting because you have the most industry related experience with the use of this score. Could you elaborate a little bit more, if possible, on shortages, or what should we do better, or what should we add? Can you reflect a little bit on that?
Shortages of terms, you mean, or
whatever,
shortages? Yeah.
whatever.
So, well, one thing would be neonatal adverse event severity scoring is great when you're in the NICU. But all of a sudden, guess what? You graduate, you go home, and you have to do longer term endpoints. So all of a sudden, you've got to have a way to say, if it's a disease you developed in the NICU and you have continued, I use the severe ROP. You should still call it ROP if you have a retinal detachment, because it's not a new adverse event. It is the continuation. So understanding the progression of adverse event terms as you go, and as we do longer term endpoints, when do you become a MEDRA-based adverse event? So that was a nuance that and had to develop rules on how are we doing this. But that will become, more and more, I think, a requirement as these infants age from a maturational
It's an
perspective.
interesting reflection. It makes me think on the growth curve that we have discussed in the first session, because also neonatologists at a given time say, well, let's stop with the preterm growth curve. We will shift lump to another model. And I never thought about it, but you somehow suggest that we also have to consider when and how to jump from one system to another. So thank you for this additional comments. And I would like to invite your colleague, Anup Shala, on How do you see this aspect? Do you have experience with the NIS? How would you integrate this in a clinical trial? How would you use this type of tools, or is it useless?
Well, thank you for the question. I'm Anup Chawla. I'm our global pediatric safety lead at AstraZeneca. Small disclaimer before I jump into the question that my views here are my own and not necessarily representative of AZ's. But that said, I want to maybe take the great feedback that my regulatory and industry colleagues have shared and roll it up one level, which I think they've given a wonderful overview of how we need to appropriately assess severity at a case level or at a potential trend level with respect to an aggregate of cases. But I'd like to speak a little bit about a product level view and what it means to get severity scoring right and the consequence of getting it wrong. So industry typically, when deciding on investment into a program, will develop something called a target product profile or a TPP. And essentially that lays out what our base case expectations are on efficacy, on safety, on a variety of factors, what our minimum or least acceptable outcome would be in order to progress the program and still achieve the desired uptake of the product, and then any potential upside. And with respect to safety, what we have to do is first identify the safety topics. If we're talking about a neonatal program, the safety topics that are either going to tip the balance on approvability or on market uptake. Plenty of health authorities in the room today. I won't talk about approvability, but uptake will mean what prescribers will be comfortable to incorporate, what guidelines may be responsive to, and overall what reimbursement may look like for the product when eventually it would be launched. And this thinking starts very early. This thinking starts before phase one, well before phase one. And so in order to identify those safety topics that we think are going to shift the balance, we need to know in quite a bit of granular detail what exactly would change the company's appetite to invest vis-a-vis what would actually shift prescriber perception of the product, guideline perception, or reimbursability. If we don't know the severity of a particular safety topic that we think constitutes a risk in the neonatal population, we can't get those conversations right because we need to know both the severity and the frequency. So by having something that standardizes the severity assessment, we're able to differentiate about how significant these safety topics may be when it comes time to eventually build the product messaging. And that can instill a great amount of prescriber confidence when we think about working with our healthcare professionals to understand what the potential use of this product looks like. That shapes the overall clinical development program, that shapes the submission documents, that shapes the post-marketing use and reimbursement narratives around the product, which brings patient value. So that's what happens if we get it right. If we get it wrong, what that means is that we haven't accurately forecasted what could actually happen, and it leads to surprises. And those surprises, of course, could halt a pediatric development program if we think that we can't stomach the risk. Or what it could do is expose patients unnecessarily into a trial where we don't have a thorough understanding. So being able to upfront have an ontology of adverse events with standardized severity will help us to be able to start those conversations from a far more evidence-driven place, take those programs through development to build the product narrative in a consistent way, and then make sure that prescriber expectations as well as guideline and reimbursement expectations are met. And that leads to shared value across the chain, both from the manufacturing and development perspective, from the regulatory view, and certainly for patients and prescribers. So certainly, to answer the question, there is a big need for standardization of adverse event severity, and NAESS is a wonderful step for us to move forward. I think what we need to see now is how this can be used more generalizably, what the regulatory appetite looks like so sponsors can appropriately respond to that in terms of building out their case reporting forms and really trying to index their target product development and claims around those assessments of severity. Because right now, I think the reason we have this panel, right, is it's very heterogeneous in practice. So looking forward to how this group will continue to shape that concept into something that has pragmatic value.
Yeah. So do I understand then your comment well that you say it's all about, to a certain extent, also expectedness? So you have to know where you're jumping in before you have more confidence to jump into this area of drug development. Is this?
That's very well said. Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Because Susan learned me about expectedness. I never thought about it when I was first working or playing with this adverse event. So thank you, Susan. I added your idea in my latest paper. So I'm really grateful for that. It's something that we as clinicians do not always think about. And perhaps we still have a few minutes left. So I would like to open the floor to anyone with a question. And there's already please.
Excuse me, I have a question that might be accused of following the saying that to a carpenter, the whole world's a nail. But certainly as a doc that takes care of these infants' eyes, I can tell you that ROP is not an isolated event, as Emin was saying, and it's a beautiful reflection of systemic disease. In fact, after every exam I do, I talk to the parents and say, you know, your baby's vascularizing normally, and this reflects blood vessels in every part of the body, and this is a reason to be happy about this current exam. But more importantly is the idea that we often use severity of ROP, or in fact, just one measure, severe ROP, which would be the neovascular form or stage 3, as an outcome. And in truth, and this is one of the most amazing things, when I first looked in an eye of a baby, I was a medical student, and it wasn't until I became trained in this that I realized that babies are not supposed to go stage 0, 1, 2, 3 regression, and that any form of ROP is a reflection of systemic disease. I would put it to you that that disease is initiated by excess oxygen. I don't want to really get into that. I don't know how much of a rabble rouser I'd be even talking about that, but it's important to always include the retinal exam because it's so easy. And especially today where we can document that with pictures, it's easy to grade, although the tools that we use don't necessarily capture peripheral disease. They're very good at looking at the vessels as they emanate from the optic nerve. And this is very sensitive as to how the baby is doing. So not only do I appreciate being here, but I always hope that you always remember that the retinal exam is a very easily obtained way of gaining some form of outcome. And I like the composite outcomes because all of these diseases are linked together. So it's good, great stuff.
Not sure if somebody wants to address that because we simply agree, I think, but.
No, totally agree.
Yes,
I
please.
invited John, so.
So I want to applaud the CPATH for team for doing what you're doing. Along the way of what I've heard regarding drug safety reporting, it is so important for whoever is reporting the AE or SAE to completely know the natural history of these preemies, because from a I mean, I think that not only are we looking at labs and quartile and things like that. Well, you know, a kid born at 21 weeks versus 36 weeks, how often do they get apnea? And is it caused by my drug? I mean, causation is really important. And we were talking about a study design. Should we, for ROP, right, we know that the kids who need it most were those born before 24 weeks. But we said, gee, what if they die? We're going to get put on clinical hold. So how I wanted to hear from our regulator friends, how would you deal with that, right? Because Hidi told us that, well, a lot of times the docs, they don't know what caused it, and it just happened, and it's easy to just blame it on a drug, right? Would you, I mean, if an investigator, I think FDA is very good about that. FDA actually asks the sponsor to do designation of causation, and they take that into account. But other agencies don't necessarily do that. They listen to the investigator. So what would be the solution here?
Gary,
I
guide us.
see we don't have much time left.
No, you're lucky.
I mean, I think the important piece is that we have the expertise at FDA. We've been very fortunate to be able to have neonatologists across all the centers at FDA, not the Center for Tobacco, but we have neonatologists, and we have, you know, a robust consultation service that is sitting back there that can help out the review divisions when questions like this come up.
So one final word, please.
Oh, I don't want to be the last because I was going to throw a wet blanket a little bit onto the conversation. I don't mean to throw a wet blanket. But I do want to just maybe provide a little bit of context into the idea of a composite endpoint, particularly as it relates to efficacy. And it is not that we don't think composite endpoints will work. In fact, if you look at the oncology space now, we're talking about molecularly targeted therapy or tissue agnostic drug development, in which you have a marker that you know is tightly linked to the pathogenesis of a particular cancer. And so if it's lung cancer or breast cancer, you can do tissue agnostic drug development. But those are places where we have a lot of confidence, very high confidence, that those molecular targets are in fact essential to the development of that particular disease. In the world of composites as it relates to this, space of neonatology, I haven't heard yet that tight linkage, and I would be remiss to say that you should just go ahead and do it. But I'm not saying that you shouldn't keep thinking about it. But one way to think about it as a staged process and in a place where it has begun to become successful is even in, I'm thinking about rheumatology or other spaces where we start out with drug development in a particular disease. So it's juvenile polyarticular idiopathic arthritis. But now as we've learned more and we say, okay, well, we also know that there's a variant of arthritis that is enthesitis related, or we have a variant that is psoriasis related. And we've been able to leverage that information in an extrapolation approach that requires you to do much less for that second disease. So my point in saying this is that not to say forget about composites, but it may be more productive to think about where you know the pathophysiology and to focus on that particular disease. And as you gain more knowledge about how these diseases are really interrelated, then to use that knowledge to help support gaining subsequent approvals.
And I don't disagree with that at all. The only thing I would kind of come back with and say, what if you're targeting a mechanism that's common to ROP, BPD, PVL, and NEC simultaneously with a small molecule that you think is going to positively impact all of those?
Just to respond to that quickly, pick the one that you think has the most likelihood to be successful. I mean, that's what I would say. And I'm not giving you advice here. I'm just saying that, but those will all lead in. I mean, the more information you gain, the more information you gain with subsequent programs.
I mean, the only other challenge I would add from our field vis-a-vis something like cancer, where you have tremendous access to primary tissue, right, which we never get. And we have to go by inference from various lab values, clinical outcomes, and the like. I think it's not an apples to apples comparator. I mean, our field is particularly challenged with the inability to get access to primary tissue to do the type of molecular phenotyping that allows very precise targeting of particular disease processes. So that's the only thing that I would sort of say. We're certainly not there yet as a field. So do we have to wait till we get there to advance therapeutics, which I would say we shouldn't.
So I just want to take us back, sorry, a little bit to sorry, Kanwaljit, to think about the fact that we have not had any therapies approved in the last 30 years. And I think that part of the problem is if we start going towards the composite endpoint, we may lose. We're having trouble identifying signals as we're looking at these therapies. We're trying to work on enriching the population where we might be able to see these signals better. And certainly the composite endpoint I think is really important, but I think we may lose some of that specificity with respect to enriching the population. We've had so many therapeutics that we thought, and we'll get into this later today, I'm sure, that we thought were going to be really game changing, where we haven't been able to show statistical significance. And I worry that as we get more diffuse in terms of the endpoint, that we may lose, some of the therapies. So as Lynn pointed out, pick the one where you think that the from the mechanism of action looks like it may be the most promising. That doesn't mean that we can't move forward in other areas, but I just worry that we'll lose some of these therapies if we go too diffuse at the beginning. Sorry.
Susie.
I really have to wrap up. Sorry. Yeah, it's a position that you have to be at a given time impolite, but I'm really happy with the enthusiasm. I'm really happy for all your contributions from different points of view, and would like to proceed to the next session with a special thanks to Ralph. I hope you also enjoyed it, and we will meet each other anyhow in the likely next weeks or months. Thank you for your attention.